Once again, I really appreciate your joining me today on Islands of Sanity. I have a very special podcast for you with two remarkable guests. Their work could not be more relevant in this moment as we're all struggling with catastrophic climate change and untold losses in our culture and in our world. For a very long time, I've been saying that one of the most important things we can do in these times is learn the skill of grieving. I'll say that again. One of the most important things we can do in these times is learn the skill of grieving. Now, that may shock a lot of people because in this culture, we want quick fixes and easy answers for incredibly complicated and catastrophic problems. When I say that learning the skill of grieving is the most important thing we can do, you may translate that into, "Oh, Carolyn, you mean do nothing." Well, today our guests are going to explain what I mean because teaching the skill of grieving is their life's work. They are not do-nothing people by any means. They are activists and warriors in coming to terms with our planetary predicament and all of the losses that it's foisting on us. My guests are Laura Schmidt and Aimee Lewis-Reau from the Good Grief Network, which you can find at goodgriefnetwork.org. Laura is a graduate of Central Michigan University with a master's in environmental humanities from the University of Utah, and Aimee is also a graduate of Central Michigan Universities with a master's in fine arts from Georgia College and State University. I'm going to let them tell you all about their journey into the work that they're doing and how their passion is igniting in this current moment of climate chaos and the collapse of industrial civilization. Welcome, Aimee and Laura, to Islands of Sanity.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. We're excited for the chat.
Yeah, me too. Well, I think it was 2 years ago this month that you both attended the workshop here in Boulder that Dean Walker and I facilitated on living resilience. And since then, I've noticed that your work is much more visible and much more desperately needed. So my first question to you today is, how did the Good Grief Network begin?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as you mentioned, I'm a graduate of the Environmental Humanities program at the University of Utah. And I created the backbones of the program there. But really what was happening was a stirring in understanding of things don't feel right, things don't seem right. I read the IPCC for the first time in one of my undergraduate classes and realized that no one was taking it seriously, the problem, not official leaders. No one was wanting to even talk about climate change. And in my undergraduate career in 2009, I read the IPCC for the first time. And I think at that point, the version I read was even a year or two old, and no one was taking it seriously. The class I was taking was called Critical Issues Facing Humanity. And I was learning all this type of information, and yet there was no dialogue about it. None of our elected leaders were taking the problem seriously. And so that stirring led me in a lot of different ways, one of which was to do a brief stint with AmeriCorps down in coastal Louisiana right after the oil spill. And that was my first on-the-ground experience, seeing the impact of the fossil fuel industry on everyday lives. And still no one was taking it seriously. There were people actively saying what I was witnessing wasn't happening. And I would talk to Aimee and I would say, no, I went to this thing. I met all these people. They're having health effects from the dispersants. They're having health effects from the oil in the water. And yet doctors aren't even being willing to treat them because they're scared of the repercussions from BP and the oil companies. Like, that was insanity to me. So this just opened up a real life example of what happens when we choose profits over people. Mm-hmm. And then my next move was to the Environmental Humanities program where Terry Tempest Williams was teaching. And so for 2 years, I got to learn from her and the other fabulous professors at the University of Utah, where they allowed me to explore the idea, okay, if we can't get everybody on board with understanding climate change is a problem, because that's unlikely, then how do we sustain the people who actively want to be looking at these problems? And that actually led me to your work. So you're one of the first people who have been talking about these for years. I've read most of your books. I haven't read them all because you're a very prolific writer. And I can't quite keep up, but the ideas are there, you know, and they're solid, and it's talking about coming together in community and really trying to move these big emotions, and, you know, what happens when we're stuck with a lot of this grief. And those are the kinds of questions I explored in my thesis. And then I let it sit for a little while because I got a job in a nonprofit, specifically working for environmental causes. So I thought I was doing my due diligence. I thought I was doing enough. And a few years into that job, realized there is no emotional support for people on the ground, or should I say very little emotional support for people on the ground trying to be change makers. So I chatted with Aimee, and she'll tell you her side of the story, but I chatted with Aimee and I said, I think it's time we bring this into the world, and we put some structure to it. And we ran through a couple pilot programs in Salt Lake City, which is where this project came out of. And I'll pause there because I think Aimee's side of the story is really great, but that's sort of the basis or the origins of the Good Grief Network.
Thanks for that, Laura. Yeah.
And my side of that is quite different. I studied poetry in undergrad and then went to get a fine arts degree in creative nonfiction. And I was really more focused on human rights-based activism. And the environmental movement felt foreign to me. And in all honesty, it felt too white to me. And so I was deeply disturbed by that. And Laura and I would have these arguments when we were younger of which activism was more important, human rights-based or environmental. And I feel like what Good Grief is what happened when we started getting to the roots of these troubles and realizing these systemic problems and how they're so much bigger than like just these individual issues, that there's a deeper problem going on. And we believe that problem is disconnection from self, others, and the natural world. And that is what fuels the destruction we see and the destructive behavior we see. And so coming from such a different background has been a really interesting place for me to be, because what I really like to focus on is language and emotions and feelings, and how does that relate to this science and this hard stuff that is coming up. And I've recently mentioned this, but in a different interview, so I don't know if it's okay to bring up, but
go for it.
We're still new to this interview thing, Carolyn. But what I love about being able to talk about this stuff is I'm influenced by Marie Howe's interview on Being, where she talked about studying under a Soviet Union professor who said, you Americans are so naive. You think evil's gonna march into your living room in big black boots, but it sneaks in through the language. And so what I feel like I've brought to Good Grief is an attention to language that, combined with Laura's deeper understanding of the climate crisis and the climate predicament that's going on, and how when we work together and we start collaborating, what can come from that. And with this 10-step program, that's what we do, is we bring people together and discuss these deeper issues and then see the magic that happens and the innovation that happens. And so that's why we're really excited that you've had us here to discuss these things, because I've never believed in something so passionately in my life. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for that. You know, I noticed that you both went to Central Michigan, which is kind of personal because I graduated from Michigan State. I grew up in Indiana, but I went to school in Michigan, so I really appreciate your Midwest roots. You both ended up in other parts of the country, but one thing I know about the Midwest is that grieving is not wildly welcomed. Midwesterners are tough people, and they believe we should all pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps and not whine. So what drew the two of you to focus on grief?
It's a great question. I'll start too, or again. So my background actually was really rocky and really unsteady. There wasn't a really solid foundation at all. Both of my parents were alcoholics or addicts more generally. I also experienced a lot of loss, both because my parents were addicts and alcoholics, but also because I had two of my best friends die in high school. So it was a really difficult time for me. I fell into a deep depression for quite some time. I'd say I'm still resurfacing from that amount of depression. And what I've been able to do, and when you hit that rock bottom so hard is you realize that you have to find reasons to live. Why are you alive if everything is so painful? And so I started really reading and looking for advice for people who have been around longer than me, because there's a reason that those people have held on for so long. So I started very early on with the big questions of why are we here? What's the point? Why are we alive? How do we protect ourselves? How do we build resilience? And so I almost feel like I was pre-programmed for this work, you know, like living a life of trauma and not really having the tools to deal with it really forced me to do my own research and to find reasons to be alive. And so that's what brought me to the grief work. I didn't know it till about 10 years ago, because I was in such a dark place that I had to crawl my way out of it first in order to know that with this amount of trauma comes gifts and comes lessons. So that's
Did you say that last part again? With this amount of trauma comes, say it again, please.
Yeah. With this amount of trauma comes lessons to be learned and shared.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for that. Did you have something to say on that, Aimee?
Yeah, thank you. And what really brought me to grief work is the level of depression I had throughout my 20s. I had chronic depression, treatment-resistant depression, because I just didn't understand how things could be so wrong in the world and why I should want to be alive. And that kind of depression takes you so close to death that grief started to feel comfortable for me. It made sense. I realized there's a lot to be grieving. And in fact, I often say, if you're not grieving right now, I grieve for you, because you're not paying attention. You're possibly unknowingly participating in the destruction in your denial of what's actually going on and looking at these hard issues. And so I think grief is the only way in. I think grief unites us at a deep level. And through my multiple depressions and multiple hospitalizations for depression, I saw the kind of community and camaraderie that comes from being at rock bottom in a circle of other people, and what comes from that. And that is when I started to notice grief is not something to be avoided or a roadblock to clear. It is a deep tool for connection if we learn how to listen to it.
Yeah. You know, I know you're familiar with the work of Francis Weller, who also has done a lot of work on grief. And one of the things he says is that depression is often unmetabolized grief. And a lot of people are so scared that, well, if I get into my grief, I'll get depressed. Well, most likely the opposite is true, is that if you don't get into your grief, you're much more likely to get depressed. And if you are depressed and you really get into your grief with safety and support, your depression is likely to lessen or even dispel.
Absolutely.
Well, and I think that you highlighted it with safety and support. And I think especially in a culture that is so hyper individualized and like competition based, that many of us don't feel like we have that safety and support. And that's essential. If we're going to look at these really hard things, we can't do it alone. We have to have that safety and support, and we have to feel brave enough to enter into these dark spaces.
Well, speaking of safety and support, the two of you have created 10 steps for learning the skill of grieving. So what are those 10 steps, and why did you choose those?
Yeah. So the 10 steps, we see them as an evolution. They won't be stagnant. You know, if we're having this conversation 10 years down the road, the world is going to look drastically different. And so our steps should fall in line with that as well. We see them as being nimble. We see them as always improving so that they might be of the greatest service to people. But basically right now, as the steps stand, the first one is the very basic: accept the severity of the predicament. And I know I said it's basic, but it's not. It's anything but. It's like the acknowledgement that you can't go back to seeing the world how you saw it before. You see the problems, they're right in your face, and you refuse to look away. With our program, we allow some freedom and flexibility in where people are coming from, because we understand that there are different levels of acceptance. And every time we work our program, you get to a new level of like, oh shit, it's bad. It's really bad. And it's hard to sit with. And so some people say that the first step is the hardest, because you're gathering a bunch of strangers together and asking them, well, where are you with your understanding of civilization collapse? Where are you with your understanding of the climate crisis? Where are you with your understanding of why this big political divide exists? You know, how are you sitting with this? Where are you at with your understanding? So that's the first step. Step 2 is about acknowledging that I'm part of the problem, but also the solution. And we use the word solution as if there were sort of one solution, and there's not. It's not this sort of we do all the right things and then everything falls into place. Instead, what we do is we acknowledge our hypocrisy because we're part of this system. We acknowledge our hypocrisy because we're part of the system. And then what we try to do is use the tools available to us to reach out to other people. And so while this civilization exists, we're going to use the internet. We're going to use our iPhones, you know, to organize and to bring people into this heart space. And we shouldn't have to feel bad about that, because what we're doing is we're trying to build a movement. And so why not use the tools available to us? That makes us hypocrites in nature, but I can live with that hypocrisy if I know I'm doing it for a greater good. So part 2, the second step, is to acknowledge that we're both complicit and complacent, but we're willing to change. We're building the momentum for change. Step 3 is about sitting with uncertainty. And this is one of my favorite ones, because it's almost as if in Western culture, we were told that if we do all the right things, our lives will be certain. If we make enough money, we can buy our white picket fence and keep everyone else on the outside and create this illusion of certainty. But in reality, certainty has never been promised. We're human animals on a very dynamic planet, and so we have to be able to learn how to sit with the fact that things are going to change around us and learn how to not be so attached to outcomes. Step 4 is about honoring my own mortality and the mortality of everything. And I think it's really important that we're able to look at death in the face. We're able to have a relationship with death and walk hand in hand, knowing that our time here on earth is finite. I am of the belief, especially having lost so many people that I love, that there is no other time to make meaning than in the present moment, because death will come for us. And whether it comes in this sort of civilization breakdown, or whether it comes because I'm driving my car on a highway and somebody pulls out in front of me, I don't get to know that. And so why not be so alive in the current moment? Why not live to be alive instead of waiting for a moment to really come to life? Step 5 is about doing inner work. And we see this as being twofold. 1, doing inner work means that if you're alive in this time and place, you have some trauma. That means you have to clear that trauma, because as we continue to see more suffering unfold before us, and if we want to dig deep into our heavy emotions, any trauma we already have preloaded in us is going to be compounded. So we need to take this opportunity while we have a relatively privileged opportunity to be able to sit around and have these conversations. We need to be doing our self-work. We need to really be looking inward and clearing some of that trauma, so that as the suffering continues to unfold, we have a better grasp over us. And then the second part of this one, do inner work, it's the same step, but it's also to acknowledge our full range of human emotions. And this culture is really feelings phobic. We're told that we should only focus on things that make us happy and never really dig into the other things. And what we're trying to say is, no, our full range of feelings are guideposts, and they have lessons to teach us. And so let's not fear them. Let's embrace them. Let's see what they have to teach us. And let's not just prioritize the good, the happy feelings, because then we really minimize the lessons that we have in the heavier feelings. So those are the first 5 steps.
And then step 6 is one of my favorites: develop awareness of brain patterns and perception. And I call this the permission to be wrong step. And what I mean by that is, the more I learn about my brain and what neuroscience can teach us about how our brain works in different parts, the more foolish it seems that we were ever taught it's not okay to be wrong, that being wrong is something to be ashamed of. And I really didn't think that intellectualism and learning about brain science would help me learn better self-compassion, but it has, and it does, which is why this is one of my favorite steps. Step 7 is practice gratitude. And that comes after the brain science step for a reason, because we're seeing how practicing gratitude shifts what part of the brain is activated. And I often tell the story about when I was depressed and I started making gratitude lists, because I tell people we're putting the grit back in gratitude. Gratitude isn't this fluffy thing of everything's nice, rainbows and butterflies. It is gritty. And the specific example I give is when I was depressed, I would make this gratitude list and it would turn into like a shame storm of what I should feel grateful for, but because I was depressed, didn't. And the revolution happened when I gave myself permission to stop with the should and feel grateful for very present moment things, like the pen that's helping me write the list, the fact that we can write symbols on a page and understand them later when we look at them, the bird singing in the tree near me. It became a very physical, embodied form of gratitude. And that's when the magic happens and the brain shift happens and you get out of that depressed, stuck place.
Well, and I want to take a moment and interrupt and also bring in this step, we talk a lot about meaning and beauty as acts of resilience as well. And in fact, I wanted the step to be called practice gratitude and create beauty and meaning, because I think that they're all the same types of thing. And it's highlighting what Aimee's saying, where it really activates this forward thinking part of our brain. And what we're seeing right now is that people are so scared. We don't know what to do. We've never faced a problem this big. It's shattering all of our values and norms. And we don't know what to put in its place once we take those away. And so what we're trying to do is recommend that people start practices like mindfulness practices, meditation. The most simple of them is to just seek beauty. And beauty can be found no matter what situation you're in. And then in this step, we also really like to bring up Viktor Frankl, who was interned in a concentration camp in World War II. And he essentially said, and I'm dumbing down his idea, but it's beautiful. And what he said is, so many things can be taken away from us. Anything can be taken away from us. But the one thing that we maintain no matter what is our response, is our ability to maintain our own composure. And so I think this is a really important lesson moving forward, that no matter what happens, we have agency in how we show up, and we have agency in how we respond. And things like practicing gratitude or finding beauty and meaning help remind us of our agency. Thank you.
Thank you for adding that, Laura. And then next is take breaks and rest, step 8. And a fun fact, it used to be take breaks and rest as needed, but we've taken off the as needed, because what we found is that when people first come to our program, they're in such despair that they don't even know when they need a break yet. They're so disconnected from feelings in the body, and they have so much shame about having these feelings that they don't even know when they need a break. So we've just built the step in to take breaks and rest. And in that step, we really dive deep into what that means, what that looks like. And I give the example of my hospitalizations in undergrad. I did not know how to take breaks, and I burned myself out. And the recovery time that it takes is much longer, much harder, and much more strenuous than if you just learned how to take breaks ahead of time. You don't have to wait till you crash and burn. We also, for this step, really love the Audre Lorde quote. And it's something, I might not get the quote right, but the idea is that self-care is not, do you remember exactly what
Basically,
it is?
Self-care is an act of political warfare, and preserving ourselves is the most countercultural thing we can do, because we're told that we have to give until we have nothing left. Right. And Aimee and I are saying, no, that's not right. And part of this step is based on that Audre Lorde quote.
We have it in our office, and it's something that inspires me daily. Political warfare, to take breaks and rest. It's anti-capitalist, it's anti-everything we've been taught. And I think that there's a real power that comes from that. It's also one of the hardest steps for people, interestingly enough. Step 9 is show up. And that comes after the take breaks and rest step, because we also believe that sometimes showing up means showing up for yourself and not going to an event or something that you had planned to go. It's about really, by now, by step 9, hopefully we have developed the self-awareness to make decisions where we're not just doing something without an awareness of why we're doing it, and that we're listening to our bodies better and honoring when we are capable of doing something and when we're not. So show up, which also sometimes means show up for yourself. And step 10 is reinvest into meaningful efforts. And step 10 used to be take action, but that felt too prescriptive because we really love the Howard Thurman quote, don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive, and go do that, because what the world needs are people who've come alive. And so what we really try to do with step 10 is get people to go inward and see where their passion meets their skill set and how they can be of service. Because at the end of the day, I believe we all want to be of service. We've just gotten so disconnected from our hearts and our guts that we forget that sometimes. And that's why we see all the fear and distrust of other in the culture, is that we don't trust that human nature to want to be of service. And so step 10 is about how can you be of service, and how can you be of service in the most strategic and effective way without bringing your own trauma and projections. I feel like the 10 steps really help strip away past beliefs, cultural expectations. It really gets people operating from a level of clarity where they can be the most effective as an activist as they can be. And we use the word activist to mean a lot of different things. That doesn't necessarily mean frontline activist out there getting arrested, although thank God for those folks. It sometimes means being more present in your interactions. It sometimes means having the courage to admit when you're not okay. And we think that's revolutionary and activist oriented as well.
Well, thank you for all of that. We could have a podcast on each one of those steps. I can't imagine why you're writing a book. But I want to ask you another question before we talk about your book. I'm wondering what changes you've observed in folks now as they practice the 10 steps.
Well, the first thing that I want to mention, and then I'll pass it over to Aimee, is that the steps are kind of guideposts, and one could participate in our program and not see any real change at all. And it's because this kind of work, just like a lot of the work that you're doing and that you're promoting, is process work. It really means that, you know, we set a safe container for an hour and a half every week to go through one step at a time. But if you're not bringing these lessons back into your life and integrating them at home, then you're not going to see any changes. And the kinds of changes that we need right now are big, and they're heartfelt, and they literally change the way that you interact with your life and the people in your life and the way that you see the world. And so I just wanted to remind people that process work is not easy. In fact, it's often hard, but it's really worth it. It's worth it in the way that we learn to interact with each other and communicate with each other. It's worth it in the way that we change our priorities for what it means to be alive in this time and place. And so, again, the short answer is that you could take our program and not see any changes. And that means that you haven't really integrated the work that we're asking of you, or that the world's asking of you. And so that's the first thing I wanted to say. But actual changes that we've seen in participants who actually participate and who take these lessons home and use these steps as tool belts going forward is so varied, and it's so inspiring. And I know Aimee has a few stories that she wants to share about that, but I just wanted to put that preface out there.
Thank you, Laura. And the short answer, Carolyn, is courage. Our steps, we witness people leaving with more courage when they've worked our program. And the longer answer about that is we've actually kind of struggled to explain to people what changes we see, because how do you explain the body language shift we see? They come in nervous and tense, and they leave a little more at home in their bodies and aware of how they can be effective, while acknowledging that they're only one human being and having to accept some limitations that come with that. And I can speak personally, from doing these steps, every time I do these steps, I go deeper. And I've done the steps about 10 times now. And I'll be frank, I don't like public speaking. I don't like being in the public eye.
Could have fooled me.
Well, right. That's the thing. We're about to give one of our first big talks in Marin County in November, and they're talking about 200 people possibly coming out. And that terrifies old Aimee. I never signed up for this, but the world is hurting. And if people are going to listen to me talk about these issues that I don't feel like are being talked about enough, who am I to sit in the corner and say no thank you? Like, what a cowardice thing to do. And so every time I work these steps, what I'm finding also is it gets a little bit isolating, because I'm losing my patience for small talk, and I'm starting to realize that participating in business as usual is enabling an action. It's keeping people comfortable. And I'm really struggling with that right now, of how do I still show up and participate in this current paradigm, you know, go out to dinner with my family or things of that nature, when all I can think about is how much the world is hurting, and that pretending everything's okay is time we could be spent doing something else more focused on productivity. And yet at the same time, our steps are all about taking breaks and enjoying that dinner with your family, right? It's this paradox, it's this tension. And so that's why I feel like it's the perfect time for us to write a book, because I'm wrestling with how to do this myself. And the deeper I go, the more I believe in the work.
Thank you so much for that. I want to come back to your book in a little bit, but right now I want to thank everyone who's joined us today. This is the second episode in my brand new Islands of Sanity podcast, ongoing and coming to you twice monthly. I have no compensation for my efforts to bring you this twice monthly podcast, and I really would like you to become a donor on a regular basis or contribute what you're able to contribute each time you listen to an episode. On the Islands of Sanity homepage, you have the option of becoming a patron. Please click on that button and become a patron as a token of your gratitude for the Islands of Sanity that each podcast offers you. And please know that I deeply appreciate your support. Today, I'm sitting with Laura Schmidt and Aimee Lewis-Reau from the Good Grief Network at goodgriefnetwork.org. They are sitting in a beautiful desert scenario at the moment. And I want you to go and check out their website, goodgriefnetwork.org, and all of the amazing resources and interviews that they share on the site. It's really a treasure trove of resources to support you in your grieving process, or perhaps your resistance to the grieving process. They are gentle and patient and so understanding of what so many of us feel as we navigate the seas of chaos and insanity in 2019. So back to you, Laura and Aimee, there in the desert. As both of you do this work, I'm wondering what you are actively grieving these days, and how you cope with your own despair.
Oh, that's an excellent question, Carolyn. I feel like my grief is extra present right now currently for me, because we just moved out of state, and any sort of big change or vulnerability in our external circumstances lets that grief in deeper, and it feels a little closer. And so I'd like to read just a paragraph from a letter I just wrote, a despairing letter I just wrote to a dear friend and mentor. I've been saying in interviews, if you're not grieving, I grieve for you. But my grief about how few folks are grieving the world's calamities is growing exponentially. Just when I think I've felt the worst of it, it returns and knocks me on my ass again. My most recent despair is realizing that some folks will choose to kill and die before they challenge the worldviews destroying our species. Never mind getting them to care about the countless species going extinct every day. That's a hard one to sit with.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that despair is something that I'm willing to share, because I think it's human. I don't think it's something to say, oh no, I'm depressed again about. I think if we're not feeling that grief of the fact that there's countless species going extinct every day, that there's going to be more human suffering, then I'm afraid. I'm afraid of the people who are not feeling the grief yet. And I think the only way to them is love. And that despair is hard for me to sit with. And so that is when I dance. I dance a lot. In fact, I dance almost every day. And when I don't, I feel it.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's angry dancing. Sometimes it's happy dancing. Sometimes it's gentle dancing while I do yoga and cry. That tool of moving my body and not adding further grief to my grief by judging it or shaming myself about it or trying to decide whether or not it's valid, that is my biggest healing point right now. And one of the tools I've really been looking into or using, and salt baths are another one. Salt baths, I'm learning guitar. I'm brand new to learning guitar, and I'm kind of a perfectionist, so it's hard for me to not be good at something. And yet I also know that's exactly what my soul needs. And what else do we like to do?
Well, I think I want to go back to the dancing for a second, because
yes.
you missed two
do.
important things. One is that we're drawing from the dancing. We really recommend, I don't dance as much as Aimee does. She has managed to open herself up and dance every day, and I think it's absolutely beautiful. And we try to encourage our participants to move their body as well, because a lot of our feelings get stuck in our bodies, and if we're not moving them, we can talk all we want about feelings and about the state of the world, but if we're not doing something to move our bodies and calm our mind, then those feelings are going to get stuck. And we base this information off of the collected poems of Alice Walker, or is it an essay collection?
It's a poetry collection called Hard Times Require Furious Dancing.
Yeah.
And so we invite everyone listening right now to begin a dancing practice. And what Aimee and I were talking about, and actually this comes up a lot, is you mentioned at the beginning of the episode how we spent some time with you and Dean Walker about 2 years ago in Boulder, Colorado. Right. And one morning we walked in, and Like a Prayer, Madonna's Like a Prayer was playing, and we all just danced. And this was a time for there was no time to be self-critical. There was no time to judge anybody else. We just came together and we moved our bodies together because we spent a weekend talking about really intense stuff. And this is a memory Aimee and I bring up a lot, because it warms our heart. It shows the power of community. It shows what happens when you're willing to put down your self-criticism. And like, you can really come together and meet people at a level if you're just dancing with them, if you're moving your body with them, if you're willing to go to that level of vulnerability, right? Like, I'm not a dancer. I've never danced. I'm not good at it. And yet it was so powerful to be in a room with people who didn't give a shit what they looked like. We just moved our bodies together.
Yes, and we talk about it often because, fun fact, Like a Prayer is one of Laura's favorite songs. And so we listen to it often and dance to it often, and we really treasure that memory because it was, I believe, Sunday morning after a weekend really going into shadow work and grief and the sacredness of dancing to such a fun Madonna song with a variety of folks still warms my heart.
Does mine too, actually.
And before we move off this topic of what are we grieving, because I think for me it changes every day. I'm grieving something every day. And what I'm seeing right now, especially because I'm still very plugged into social media and media in general, is I'm seeing a lot of the grief that the children are having for not having a childhood, for not even being allowed to be children right now. As I'm gonna switch gears real quick. Every day that we're alive is a gift, and every day that we're alive, we're gonna see the increasing impacts of what we've done on this planet. And what Aimee and I talk about a lot is the idea that kids should be allowed to be kids right now, because for the rest of their lives, they are gonna have to fight. They are gonna have to invoke their courage and their compassion. They are gonna have to do things that we didn't have to do as kids. And so right now, as the world is asking kids to step up, we are actively thinking that kids need time to develop and that kids need time to play and that it really should be the adults who are stepping up and who are making change. And many of them are, but not enough. And so what I'm grieving, and part of this is what I'm grieving in myself, is that I had such a tumultuous childhood that I thought, and I was told by my culture, that if I did all the right things, my life could finally be easy. And then you realize that that's not true. That's a fallacy. We are in for some really hard and dark times, and so we need to reframe the question. And so I'm grieving my ideal imagined future, which will never come. I'm grieving the ideal imagined future that the kids won't have to have, and I'm grieving the idea that we're looking to kids to save us. That's bullshit. Let them be kids. Let them have a fucking childhood, and let them learn all the things that are beautiful about the earth before this goes away, and before they have to step into such an important role that I don't think they're ready to step into yet. And so those are the kinds of things that I'm grieving right now. Those are the kinds of things I'm grieving right now.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. And if I could add to that, the idea of looking to the kids, I am doing it too. We all are saying these kids are giving us hope, and like, thank the stars for that, you know, like we need hope right now. And also their courage is pointing at all of us and saying, what are you doing about it? We're teenagers, we're kids. We didn't ask to come into this world like this. Why is it like this? And most adults are still twiddling their thumbs and saying, the world's fine, it's not as bad as they say. And I'm angry about that. And I think anger is a part of grief. Yeah. And I think it's righteous anger. And we're a little extra amped up about this particular topic because right now kids and climate grief is a trendy media topic. We're getting requests for interviews about the specific topic. And rather than sensationalizing their grief or making them heroes, why don't we actually do something about what they're grieving is kind of how I feel about it right now.
So I want to take just a couple minutes to, I've got some more questions, but I'd like to just quickly ask you about the book. Do you have a working title for it yet? Where are you with it? What's the focus?
We are currently working on the second chapter. We have an outline. It's going to be about how our 10 steps work as a whole and the story of how we came to create the 10 steps. Wonderful. And why they exist, because we created the program we needed, and I think that's important.
And then also we want to touch on what's on the other side of this climate grief. What's on the other side of eco-anxiety? How do you hold the tension of knowing that a lot of the things that you love and value are going to change in drastic ways? And then how do you keep going? And I want to address that as well. We're so new into writing it that we don't have a working title, and I think it's pretty exciting. And then one of the other tensions we're holding is that our publisher doesn't want to put the book out for another year and a half, which in a year and a half in this timeline is so different. You know, how do you write for the future that is a year and a half away when we'll hopefully have a new president? You know, so many things are at play right now, and every day is another reminder of the intensity of storms and the fires and the vector-borne illnesses that are being spread around. You know, how do you write for a future a year and a half how do you write for something a year and a half in the future when many of us can't even put our heads around what's happening right now? That's our book.
Thank you so much for that, and I really wish you well with that book, because my goodness, do we need it.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'd like to speak to the rainbow in the room as opposed to the elephant in the room, which is the fact that the two of you are not just colleagues, but you're also in a long-term, committed, loving relationship. The times we live in are incredibly stressful for anyone in a marriage or romantic partnership. Can you tell us a bit about how you met, which I assume was at Central Michigan? Were you already on the same page about collapse? Was one of you wearing a t-shirt that said collapse aware? Seriously, how did you meet, and did you get woke together or at different times?
Oh, I love this question. A lot of people are afraid to ask about our relationship because they treat us as colleagues, but we were actually best friends for 8 or 9 years before we decided to be in a relationship together. And there's 2 versions to when we met. The first story is that I didn't like her at first. The second version is that we were instant, inseparable best friends, and both are true depending on the exactness of the story. The first time we met was in a geology club class, and we were forced to do group work, which Laura did not like. I was a sophomore English major taking a geology class. She was, a fourth or fifth year senior science major taking it as kind of a blow-off class. And so we were forced to be in the same group. And so there was some tension there about how to take a quiz together. But the geology club opened up some travel in the Southwest for spring break at a very affordable rate to our class. We both went, and once we met outside of class and could have authentic discussions, we were instant best friends. And I knew something was different about her, and some of that was her willingness to talk about grief and hard things.
And so I'm intrigued by your word woke, like how we woke up, because I think the thing that attracted us to each other was that we were waking, and that we were noticing patterns that were not serving us in the larger culture. And all of our friends reinforced those patterns, and yet when we would get together, we'd be like, well, why are we doing this? That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't bring meaning. And so our initial drive for what brings meaning, what brings joy, why are we alive, those types of questions are really what propelled us forward. And that allowed us also to individually go to grad school and to try to find where our skills meet our talents and our passions. And then it brought us back together in Salt Lake City. I had a job, and Aimee didn't want to be in academia anymore. She realized that was not serving her. And so I said, I have a job, I'll float you for a little while. And after about 2 months of living together, she said, I think we should just be together. Why are we wasting our time with other people when we can have everything we want? We can have hard discussions. We can be colleagues. We can basically learn how to navigate this world that is really unsupportive at many times. And we can have that support with each other. And that's been almost 4 years now that we've been together. And it's been the best decision of my life. I mean, hopefully yours.
Certainly. And it was a tough transition to go from being friends to romantic relationship. But what was happening, we realized, is that we were so afraid of what we would lose that we couldn't focus on what we might gain. And what we have gained is a love I could have never imagined. A love I didn't think existed is what we have, and that is what allows me to be braver. I couldn't do this work without knowing I have the security and the safety of Laura's love. I wouldn't. I'd be hiding in a corner somewhere, probably, maybe occasionally writing a book.
Well, and I think if you don't mind, Carolyn, I just wanted to say real quick that the idea of us focusing on what we can lose instead of what we can gain is exactly where we are with our culture as well. You know, there are so many things that are not serving us. And for the majority of us, white, middle class, the system is mostly working for us until it's not. And so to have this idea in our mind, oh, well, but we might lose this, we might lose this convenience. But what can we gain from having a more heart-centered culture where we can actually be vulnerable with each other, and we can talk about things that matter, and we can open up to the beauty and the meaning that exists in this time and place. And so I think that's a really important bridge to draw between our personal relationship and the culture at large.
Right on.
Which leads me then to the next question, the final question. You have this loving relationship with each other, and you're doing your life's work together. But even as idyllic as that sounds, can you say a bit about the pressures and stresses on you as you do this work in the world, and just work hard to nurture and maintain this beautiful relationship you have?
Yes, because that's the side people don't get to hear about much or see as much. And it is hard. It is hard to do this work we both care about so much, especially when we disagree about how to move forward on something. And so a current issue we've been having that I think we're starting to finally see as a gift is that we've been going so hard because we believed in this work. We've been saying yes to any interview or thing that we can do, and now we want to be more selective and only say yes to folks like you who are willing to go deep. We don't have as much energy for, or I should say more specifically, I don't feel like I have the energy for some of the other types of interviews. And Laura is a phenomenal organizer. She's great on the computer with technology. I find it very overwhelming, draining, and stressful to be on the computer. And so that's been a struggle for most of our time together. But what we're realizing is that if I take care of myself, which it turns out I'm very sensitive and it requires a lot of self-care for me to operate at a healthy level. But when I do that, and when I show up in our meetings and I facilitate, something happens, a shift happens. And so I'm starting to own my power. It just looks different than what we thought it would. And so for a long time, I've had a lot of guilt that Laura's the one doing all the hard work on the computer and feeling like I could contribute as much. And in the last year, we were gifted free housing in Nebraska. That's why we lived in Nebraska. And in that time and space and being gifted time for contemplation is really when I've started to feel like, oh yeah, good grief is mine too. It's my work too. It started as Laura's, but now I've given my heart, I've given my energy. And so that's one issue that we've seen a lot. I'd love to hear your side on
well,
things.
And to take a step back, I think what Aimee's trying to say is that what we've realized is that our skill set is very different in each of us. And so I'm good at things that maybe Aimee doesn't have a lot of strengths in, and Aimee is really great at a lot of things I don't have strengths in. And so when we're able to work together and nurture this relationship, we can bring both of those skill sets forward, and it kind of makes us a powerhouse, I think. But what's really important is that we are oftentimes really patient with each other, and we have to be. I mean, we both have clinical depression, and we both have anxiety, and we're both choosing to look at a culture that is falling apart at the seams, and we go into it head first every day for the whole day. And that takes a lot of energy, and it does put a lot of strain on our relationship. But then when we realize that the answers, even though they seem abstract when we talk about them, are about love and patience and compassion and seeing people where they are, and we can take those values and put them to work in our relationship and model that for other people. And another thing that we really try to do is we try to be transparent with people. You know, we try to tell you where we're at, because it doesn't serve people who listen to us or hear us talk or see us to give you a story that you want to hear. Instead, we want to tell you where we're at and where our struggles are and how we're developing, so that maybe if you're in a phase of development, you can be transparent as well, and you can feel that connection, and you can feel like you're supported. And so that's where a lot of our relationship is just trying to be open, honest, transparent, patient, caring. And those are the same values that we try to turn outward as well.
So I have one final question for you.
We're ready.
Okay. If there were one thing the two of you would like our listeners to know, what would it be?
Ooh. So does that actually mean two things? Aimee gets one thing and Laura gets one thing?
That's correct, it does.
One thing.
I know what I want to say, and that is that I've been saying grief is not a roadblock to plow through, but a tool. But I think I'm furthering it into the idea that emotions and feelings are not a weakness or inconvenience. They're actually another way for us to take in the world, and they tell us things. And when we integrate them with our brain, we have a level of clarity and consciousness that I think is where we need to be operating from right now, given the state of the world. And so I want to reclaim feelings. I cry almost every day, and I'm owning that now, because I think that's how my body processes these heavy grief feelings that I work with, and that's where the power comes from. And so I just see how much shame still exists in our culture for even scientists showing emotion about their deepest passions. And I want to change that. I want to challenge it. I want to ask why we're even still following those rules.
Well, you know, you'll appreciate, Aimee, as a literature person, There was this guy you've probably heard of. His name is William Blake. And he once said, emotions are influxes of the divine.
Oh, I like that. Thank you.
And Laura?
The thing I would want to remind people who are waking up and who are experiencing these heavy feelings is that the time is begging us to be courageous. And I think that many of us get scared when we're up against something that we don't know and we can't maybe foresee the outcome of it. But courage is acting even if you have fear. Courage is still showing up every day. And courage might look different for all of us, but right now is a time to be courageous. And I was thinking on the drive down about some of the times that I could have been courageous, but I chose fear instead. And I'm trying to be forgiving of myself. I'm trying to be forgiving of the times that I couldn't show up. But now that I know better, I can do better. And I think that's true for everyone. I think that what's being asked for us right now is, as Aimee said, to turn inward and acknowledge our feelings and use those as points of information so that we can make our best decisions while moving forward with courage. And these times need us to step up. You know, it's not a time to play small. Even if you're not a public speaker, you know, don't go hide in the corner. If you have something to say, just try to say it. And I think that the courage can start small with conversations with your family and your friends and your community. And I think that real change happens there. Any change that's going to happen with regard to a revolution, it has to happen at the grassroots level, and it happens with opening our hearts, being courageous, and having conversations with the people near and dear to us. And that's what I have to say.
I just want to remind people that you can contact Laura Schmidt and Aimee Lewis-Reau at goodgriefnetwork.org. Go there and check out the 10 steps and the resources they offer you for being present with your grief in these times that are filled with so much loss. Laura and Aimee, thank you so much for being with me today. Also, Islands of Sanity listeners, please go to the Podbean page where you get this podcast and become a patron. Thank you in advance for your generosity. I deeply appreciate your support. And until next time, this is Carolyn Baker offering you Islands of Sanity in a troubled sea of chaos.